Tom, as always, it seems like every week there's another breach disclosure, another cyber security issue. But we're starting to see the government take these things seriously. And that's what happened with regard to the SolarWinds case. Now, SolarWinds, if I can editorialize for a minute, I feel like SolarWinds was almost unfairly singled out as being, this egregious breach, when there have been egregious breaches for so many companies. But now we're seeing the SEC getting involved. So talk a little bit about how the government is getting involved in data breaches.
And I think it's an important story, Stephen, because if we wanted to sit here and list all of the data breaches that happened in 2023, this would be a 6-hour mega episode on the level of hardcore history, but we're not going to do that. I can pretty much nail it down to some very easy things. Lots of companies got hit. It was a lot worse than they thought. Microsoft and Okta are probably the two biggest stories. You know that because you're still hearing about fallout from both of them. And we covered those as much as we could in the rundown, but it seemed like every few weeks we were getting more and more that was getting dug up on it. Stolen signing certificates. 100% of customer data was stolen. It was so bad that in March, we started to hear rumblings that the SEC was getting mad. But you know how government stuff works, right? It takes a little bit of time for that to get beefed up. Well, that happened around July. In fact, it was right after the 4th of July holiday that we started to hear that the SEC was taking a look at the SolarWinds CFO and CISO. And everyone was like, well, that's really interesting because executives don't get punished in this part of the world. Like obviously they have to answer some very tough questions, but nothing really happens after that. And from there on, the SEC seemed determined that they were going to put a stop to this. So in August, they announced that there was a new window for disclosing breaches that were of a material nature to a company's bottom line. How short of a window? 4 days. No longer could you hide it in the language of whatever and wait until your 10K had to be filed at the end of the quarter. You had to disclose immediately if it was a material breach. Now, as I mentioned on an episode of The Rundown, you can get squirrely with whatever you want to call a material breach, but the fact remains is that you have to disclose that. Important note, those rules actually did not take effect until this month, and we know that because a breaching company tried to take it out on a different company last month in November. We covered that on The Rundown as well. Where it got really interesting was in October, right around Halloween, when we found out that the SolarWinds CISO had been indicted. This was a groundbreaking release because it suddenly made it abundantly clear that no one was going to be safe from being indicted. As you mentioned at the beginning, Stephen, this may have been a little heavy-handed. But unfortunately, when you, just like every oldest child out there knows, when you're the one that gets caught breaking the rules for the first time, you have to bear the hardest weight of the punishment before everybody comes back and goes, maybe that was a little too much. We won't know the outcome of this trial for a while because there's a lot of evidence that has to be presented. There's a lot of argument that has to take place. I think there will ultimately be a plea deal, if I'm going to editorialize a little bit. The reason for that is because the SEC has proven that they are going to enforce their rules. Companies can no longer use the excuse, well, I didn't know what was going on. And so they're going to have to be more engaged. That means that companies are going to have to rewrite their own rules to make sure that they're following what they've been saying for years so that it can't come back on them after the fact and they can find their CFO, their CEO, their CTO being sued in the same way. I would fully expect this will not be the last lawsuit that the SEC brings, but it very well may be the last one that it's brought where ignorance was used as an excuse. Stephen, the other big deal that we saw here in 2023 that felt like it took the whole year to come to fruition was, of course, Broadcom's landmark acquisition of VMware.